Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and today I want to cover chapter 10 in our text. And this is really kind of a cool time in American history. So it spans between 1820 and 1840, and there's a lot of stuff going on. So depending upon where you're coming from as a historian, if you're more into politics, it's really sort of the Jacksonian era. And if you're more into technology and the economy, it's really called the time of market revolution in the U.S. So there's a lot of stuff going on. There's economic growth. I would argue that there's the beginnings of the U.S. as an international player, maybe not superpower, but at least player. And also underlying all of this expansion in the economy and political changes is the issue of slavery and race, which really emerges during this time as well. So to kind of bring you up to date where we're at, if you go to chapter 10, I'm going to talk mainly about some of the questions at the end of the textbook. So I think that's what you need to focus on. And I'm going to post my reading notes out here on our class website that you can look at as we go through. And we will have either a quiz or an exercise, and it's going to concentrate on these central questions. So I'm going to glance away just for a second. The big questions, review questions for this chapter is, first, how did the United States show self-confidence after the War of 1812? So the War of 1812 is sort of a turning point because we're getting out of this early colonial revolutionary era into some stability in the U.S. And even though the U.S. was agreeably, weak during the War of 1812, its infrastructure started to grow. And if you remember anything about the ramp up to the War of 1812 and the idea that we boycotted getting goods from the UK, and it sort of began to build up our infrastructure and manufacturing base in a small way. So there's that part. And then the other thing we're going to talk about is the Missouri Compromise, which really sort of is this line in the sand as far as slave states and free states, and starts this narrative, or really begins to set us up for what's going to become the major event in U.S. history, which is the Civil War, although that's coming way down the road. The other review question is, how was slavery generally practiced in the U.S.? And so we'll talk about that, the relationship between Southern slavery and Northern capitalism. And then I want to talk a little bit about the Jacksonians and the coalition between Southern planters and Westerners and Northerners, and sort of this idea of a populist president in Andrew Jackson. So those are kind of the big themes here, and I apologize, I'm glancing off at my notes. So the first thing is this question of how did the U.S. gain confidence or show confidence after the War of 1812? And it's really easy. There's two main themes to this question, in my opinion. First of all, the economy really started to grow. Not only did textile manufacturing take off in the North, but the slave economy really took off in the South. With production of cotton, with production of tobacco, and then still some production of rice in the South and the East. So really slavery really expands, and slavery's never good, and it really expands in a brutal way. So that's one thing that happens. You have this slave-driven economy in the South and this manufacturing and shipping economy in the North, and they both start to expand. And during this period of time, Madison is president. He really despises Hamilton's First National Bank, but recharters it, and the Second National Bank takes hold and has a lot of power as far as controlling currency in the country. So I just give you that as background information. The other thing are these ideas to promote infrastructure. So there was something called the National Road, which went from the East Coast to like Wheeling, West Virginia today. And so it's the beginning of infrastructure projects that are necessary for the economy to thrive. And there's a lot of debate about that. Now, again, that brings up this idea of, should the government fund all of this stuff, or should it be private enterprise, or should it be the states that fund it? And there was not a big infrastructure project under Madison, but the idea of the National Road is there, and it's something for us to think about. These debates are still in place today. So it's not the interstate system, that's for sure. We're talking about one road, but this notion that the country is starting to expand economically means that there needs to be some infrastructure in place for shipping of goods and services. Now, this is before the railroad, so the railroad didn't exist yet, and it's really before the canal movement, or at least canals start kind of during that time. But again, when you're a historian of business or a historian of technology, you think about infrastructure and transportation as really important as far as allowing business and agriculture to thrive, because you have to ship your goods to markets, and the economy in a small way becomes less localized and more nationalized. I think that's fair to say, or at least the beginnings of it. So again, the economy starts to grow, and as far as the U.S. becoming an economic superpower like it is today, it wasn't even close to Europe at that time. But again, you could argue that this expansion of the market and this expansion of capitalism are the seeds for economic superpower status that comes, hundreds of years later, or actually not that long after, because when we get into the Gilded Age, which we won't in this class, but after the Civil War, the economy really thrives, and this is sort of the beginning of that idea. The other thing is the U.S. as an international powerhouse. So James Monroe becomes president in 1816, and he's really a pro-growth guy. And one of the things he does is, you may have heard of the Monroe Doctrine, and under the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. basically declared that it was going to be the policeman of the Western Hemisphere. And that idea, the Monroe Doctrine, obviously stuck around, up to today, where it was stated that no new European interest are going to come into North America or South America and colonize anything, that the U.S. was really the overseer of the Western Hemisphere. So you need to know what the Monroe Doctrine is, because we even talk about it today still, that our influence in the West really is without question, and it's sacrosanct. So that's what the Monroe Doctrine is, and that's all the way back to 1823, when President Monroe talked about this in his annual message to Congress. So the Monroe Doctrine is important, and this idea of market revolution or economic expansion is important, and those all go to the question of how the U.S. became more confident after the War of 1812. The other thing was this notion of Missouri Compromise. So at the time, there were 21 states, and Missouri petitioned to come in as a state to the U.S. and as a state that had a constitution that was racist, didn't allow any free black people into the state at all. And there was controversy with, the whole Louisiana Purchase and everything going on out west, whether these were going to become free states or slave states. So it sets us up for this debate between northern abolitionists, people that didn't want slavery, and southerners whose economy depended upon slavery. And so the big compromise there was there was a senator named Henry Clay, who worked this compromise out, and it was basically agreed to that Missouri could come in as a slave state if Maine came in as a free state. So this notion of a balance of 11 free states and 11 slave states is indicative of the strength of slavery as a vital part of the economy, but also the Southern interest. And obviously this was not going to be sustainable. We already know that from history, but it's important to think in terms of the Missouri Compromise to at least illustrate how strong slavery was, but also, I think, really the beginnings of this national narrative about race and free black people, and how this was going to start to shake out. You see the formation of these arguments and narratives in politics, which I think is an important starting point to these bigger questions about race, which would manifest themselves not only in the Civil War, but I would say still today. So Missouri Compromise is an important part. And then this notion of what was going on with slavery in the first place. I already mentioned, there was cotton, there was sugar, there was rice, there was tobacco. Slavery and the way it manifested itself in the U.S. at that time was varied. Certainly, the most brutal kind of slavery was on sugar plantations and cotton plantations. But if slavery could be less bad, it certainly was in the rice fields. So it varied. There were large plantations that were generally pretty brutal in nature, and there were small slaveholders as well, where slave family units weren't necessarily broken up. So overall, there was a variety of slavery in the U.S., most all of it agriculture related or agricultural in nature. And I think the book does a pretty good job of summarizing how slavery manifested itself in the country at the time. The one thing to know for sure is that it was embedded in Southern culture. And the other thing, which leads us into the other question, is, it wasn't just this black and white, anti-slavery in the North and pro-slavery in the South. You have to understand that the entire country, the economy of the North, depended upon the slave economy in the South, because during that time there was a lot of textile mills that had opened up in the Northeast, up in the New England area, and those textile mills counted on cotton from the South and other goods and services from the South to thrive. So there was this direct relationship between the Southern slave system and the Northern manufacturing system, and it was sort of ironic because in the North, the workers were, free market. It was a free labor system, much like our system is today, where you go to work and you get paid. In the South, obviously, all the work was done by slaves, or most all the work was done by slaves. And even though these two systems were diametrically opposed, they were really dependent upon each other to thrive. So those are sort of the really big themes for the chapter. And the last one is the Jacksonian coalition. So I want to talk about that a little bit as far as political stuff goes. So Andrew Jackson in the election of 1828 is running, and he's sort of the popular outsider. I'll call him a populist because it was really the working class people who he appealed to. And I think there's some similarities between, if we're talking about a populist movement, we can look at the Trump election of last year and really this populist movement as far as working class people and this message of making the economy great again, sort of this group of manufacturing and working class people who feel like they're dealt a raw deal by Washington, that Washington was too big, too bureaucratic, and too elitist to care about them. And so with the election of Jackson in 1828, you had a similar kind of thing going on. And there's a good sentence, and I'm going to read it from page 309 of our text, that said Jackson was selected by a cross-section of voters who identified with his stance as an outsider. So again, this notion of a Washington outsider was important even back then, because all of the presidents up to that time, whether it's Madison or Adams or I would argue even Washington and Jefferson, they were sort of Eastern elitist, career politicians, if you will. And Jackson, was a famous war hero, and he was from Tennessee, and there was a lot of popular support for him amongst regular folks. So that's one of the reasons he won the election. Now, the other thing that's important, we think that politics is brutal today, but during Jackson's time it was as well. His wife, Rachel, was divorced, and that was something that the media really took hold of, that the president was married to a divorcee, which was scandalous, and then there was also questions on whether or not her divorce was actually legal and final. So there was a lot of name calling for Rachel Jackson. A lot of people called her a whore. And so really when you think about politics today and you think about the Jacksonian era, it was every bit as brutal as it is today. So I think it's important to not think of, boy, we live in a really polarized time, which we do, but that was going on during the Jackson election as well. Jackson, being this populist, came in. He canceled the charter for the Second National Bank of the U.S., which eventually put the economy in a tailspin, and he thought that the bank was the purview of the privileged and the powerful. So again, being this populist kind of working class guy, he made sure that one of his first big things was to eliminate the National Bank of the U.S., and that was controversial at the time. The other thing he did was he was in office and initiated the Indian Removal Act. So removing all of the Native Americans that were left on the east, basically, to west of the Mississippi River. So you've probably heard of the Trail of Tears. Again, this action where Indians are being marched out of the east across the Mississippi River into the west, because Jackson was, very much racist, and so it was not a great thing for the Native Americans at all. And I think that this era is important because it shows how the economy begins to grow. At the same time, it shows how slavery is a vital part of the economy, and I think that it shows how racism is sort of baked in to the country at the time, even in the 1820s, and it's something that is still with us today. So that's a short synopsis of Chapter 10. It's actually a good chapter. It's important that you read all the way through it, and I'll talk to you again next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.